Celia pressed a trembling hand against Lior's burning forehead, her fingers brushing against the delicate ridges of his skin. His shallow breaths came in weak gasps, and his once bright eyes were now dull, half-lidded, barely able to focus on her. The fever had ravaged him faster than she had feared. Every passing hour stole more of him away, and she was helpless against it. The room around them was small, the walls a pale, earthen hue, dimly illuminated by the soft glow of bioluminescent fungi lining the ceiling. It had always been a humble home, but now it felt like a prison, the air thick with desperation. She had exhausted every known remedy, boiled roots, crushed herbs, whispered prayers to the old gods, but none of them could stop the disease spreading through her child's fragile body. She had known this was coming. The sickness had arrived in the outer districts weeks ago, a cruel affliction that targeted the young and the weak. Whispers of its reach had spread like smoke, but there had been no warnings, no official acknowledgement from the authorities. Celia had tried to believe they would act, that the Planetary Council would send aid, but the silence had been deafening. Lior let out a whimper and her heart clenched. He was slipping further. The realization struck her like a physical blow. She could no longer wait. The medicine existed. It was real. But it was beyond their world, beyond their reach, locked behind unbreakable laws. She had gone to the healers first, pleading with them, but their hands were tied. The council forbids any off-world medicine, they had told her, their voices laced with quiet regret. We do not have the technology to replicate it. She had gone to the council representatives next, standing outside the government halls for hours, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she waited for an audience. They had turned her away with cold, dismissive glances, as if her pain were an inconvenience. Even when she fell to her knees before them, voice hoarse from begging, they did nothing. That was when the desperation had taken root. If the officials would not help her, she would find another way. She had heard the rumors, quiet murmurs of humans who still found ways into the city despite the laws forbidding trade with them. They were outcasts, smugglers, criminals in the eyes of the council. Dangerous. Yet right now Celia did not care about danger. She only cared about Lior. Her legs felt weak as she left their home, stepping onto the narrow streets that wound through the lower district. The city loomed around her, buildings carved from the same pale stone, their surfaces glowing faintly with embedded crystals. The night air was thick with the scent of rain and smoke, and though the streets were mostly empty at this hour, she kept her hood drawn low over her face. Even now eyes could be watching. She had been told to go to the market near the river docks, the place where those who lived in the shadows conducted their business. It was a dangerous place for someone like her. A mother, a citizen, someone who had never before stepped beyond the lines of what was permitted. But there was no other choice. The market was alive with movement, a stark contrast to the silent, structured order of the upper city. Stalls were pressed together in chaotic clusters, filled with goods that should not exist here. Off-world metals, stolen rations, alien technology dimly humming with energy. The scent of foreign spices mingled with the sharp tang of sea air, and voices spoke in hushed, hurried tones, wary of who might be listening. She kept her head down and moved with purpose, ignoring the way her heart pounded in her chest. She had been given a name, a contact, someone who might help. She found him near the docks, leaning against a stack of cargo crates, his sharp human features partially hidden in shadow. Captain Daniel Reyes. His clothing was worn, his boots caked with dried mud, and his stance was relaxed, but Celia could see the way his gaze flicked over the market, assessing every movement. A man who was always calculating the risks. He looked at her with mild curiosity as she approached, but before she could speak he said, "You're not supposed to be here." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Celia swallowed hard, steadying herself. "I need your help." Reyes sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "You and everyone else." He turned as if to leave, but she stepped forward, grabbing his sleeve. "Please," she said, her voice raw. "It's my son. He's dying." He hesitated then, his gaze flicking to her face, studying her. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny, the way he measured her desperation. "The medicine exists," she continued. "I know it does. I just need someone who can bring it here." Reyes exhaled sharply and shook his head. "You don't understand what you're asking." She clenched her fists. "Then explain it to me." His expression darkened. "If I get caught smuggling medicine onto this planet, your council won't just punish me. They'll use it as an excuse to tighten their grip, to make sure no human ever sets foot here again. They'll let your people die before they let us help? Celia felt her chest tighten, but she refused to look away. Then I'll pay. Whatever it takes. Reyes gave a short, bitter laugh. You can't afford it. For the first time, the weight of failure threatened to crush her. But then she saw it. The flicker of something behind his guarded expression. A hesitation. A crack in the wall he had built around himself. I have nothing left to lose, she whispered. But my son still has a chance. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Reyes muttered a curse under his breath and looked away. Damn it, he sighed. I must be out of my mind. Hope flared in Celia's chest, but she didn't dare breathe it into existence just yet. Reyes turned back to her, his jaw set. I'll see what I can do. But if this goes wrong... His voice trailed off as if he didn't want to finish the thought. Celia met his gaze, determination burning in her eyes. Then I will take that risk. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The market buzzed around them, the world continuing as if nothing had changed. But something had. For the first time since this nightmare began, Celia felt a sliver of hope. Daniel Reyes had taken many dangerous jobs in his lifetime, but this one felt different. Smuggling weapons, stolen tech, even people, he had done it all. But medicine? That wasn't just illegal, it was personal. It meant saving a life. And saving lives was a dangerous habit for men like him. He shouldn't have said yes. As he maneuvered his ship, the Wayfarer, through the tangled web of orbital patrols, he kept replaying the moment he agreed to help the alien woman. Celia. He had seen the desperation in her eyes. The quiet, unwavering determination of a mother who had already decided that no law, no threat, no consequence would stop her. He had wanted to walk away. He still could have. But something had held him there, something he didn't want to name. Now there was no turning back. The coordinates on his console blinked, guiding him toward a neutral outpost floating in the black void between two warring systems. It was an ugly thing, a half-forgotten relic of a time when this part of space had been important. Now it was little more than a den for criminals, pirates, and those desperate enough to risk everything for what they needed. As he approached, his calm crackled to life. State your business, a gruff voice demanded. Daniel sighed. Just a simple trade. The pause stretched too long. The kind of silence that meant someone was deciding whether to let you in or blow you out of the sky. Finally the reply came. Docking Bay 9. Don't be stupid. Daniel smirked to himself. No promises. The station smelled of rust, stale air, and too many bodies crammed into too little space. He kept his head down, moving quickly through the winding corridors, past makeshift market stalls selling everything from alien pets to stolen military rations. He ignored the offers, the leers, the lingering gazes of those trying to decide if he was worth robbing. His destination was a small, dimly lit room tucked away behind a reinforced door. Inside, a woman sat behind a metal desk, her sharp blue eyes cutting through the smoke-filled air. Zaina Voss. I was starting to think you got yourself killed, she said, leaning back in her chair. What's so important that you risk coming here? Daniel pulled out a data chip and slid it across the desk. I need a very specific kind of medicine. Fast. Zaina picked up the chip and slotted it into her console. The screen flickered, displaying the medical compound and its properties. She let out a low whistle. You really know how to pick 'em, Reyes. This isn't just restricted, it's buried. Hard to get, harder to move. Can you do it? Zaina smirked. You know I love a challenge. Then her expression darkened. But this kind of risk doesn't come cheap. Daniel leaned in. Name your price. She studied him for a long moment, then tapped a few commands into her system. I can get it, but you're not gonna like what it'll cost. He already didn't. The deal was made, and soon Daniel found himself back on the Wayfarer, watching the cargo bay doors hiss shut as the small, unassuming case was loaded aboard. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The weight of what was inside sat heavy enough in his chest. Now came the hard part. Smuggling the medicine onto Celia's planet was going to be tricky. The authorities had tightened security, scanning every incoming vessel for contraband. He had planned for this. He had contingencies. But the universe had a way of laughing at plans. The moment he hit Atmo, the sirens started blaring. His hands flew over the controls as he swerved, diving low over the desert landscape, trying to shake the lock-ons. The planetary patrol wasn't messing around. 3 sleek, high-speed interceptors were on his tail, firing warning shots close enough to rattle his teeth. "This is the worst idea I've ever had," he muttered, pushing the ship harder. The radio crackled. "Unidentified vessel, you are violating restricted airspace. Power down immediately or be fired upon." Daniel gritted his teeth. He could outrun them. Probably. But that would only buy him time. He needed a way in. Then an idea. A stupid idea. With a few quick keystrokes, he initiated a signal burst. A distress beacon mimicking the signature of an incoming meteor. The planetary defense systems registered it as a natural threat, and within seconds, sirens erupted across the comms. The interceptors hesitated. Just for a second. But that was all he needed. Daniel slammed the thrusters, diving straight toward the canyon below. It was a brutal maneuver, sending the ship screaming through narrow rock formations at speeds that made his vision blur. Behind him, the interceptors struggled to follow. One clipped the edge of a ridge and spun out in a fiery explosion. The others peeled off, unwilling to risk the same fate. Heart pounding, Daniel adjusted his course, slipping into the lower atmosphere unnoticed. He had made it through. Barely. The landing was rough, the ship groaning as it settled in the outskirts of the city. He had arranged for Celia to meet him at an abandoned storage facility, a place where no one would ask questions. When she arrived, she looked worse than before, her face gaunt, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "Is it here?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded, stepping forward and pressing the small case into her hands. She clutched it like a lifeline, her breath hitching as she opened it, revealing the vial inside. For the first time, her composure cracked. She looked up at him, eyes bright with something between gratitude and disbelief. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't," Daniel said gruffly. "Just make sure it works." She hesitated as if she wanted to say more, but there was no time. She turned and disappeared into the night, the medicine clutched tightly against her chest. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He should have felt relief. Instead, all he could feel was the weight of what came next. Celia ran. The case was clutched so tightly to her chest that she could feel the ridges of its edges pressing into her skin, but she didn't loosen her grip. She couldn't. Every breath felt like fire in her lungs, but she pushed forward, feet pounding against the damp stone streets as she wove through the winding alleys of the lower district. She kept her head down, her hood pulled low, her thoughts singular. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she reached their home, shoving the door open and locking it behind her. The room was quiet, too quiet. The low, crackling hum of the wall fungi offered the only light, casting everything in pale, shifting shadows. Her mother, hunched in the corner beside Lear's cot, looked up as she entered, her weary eyes widening. "You have it?" she asked, voice hoarse from hours of whispered prayers. Celia didn't answer. She was already moving, falling to her knees beside her son. His breathing was shallow, his skin alarmingly cool to the touch. Too much time had passed. If she had been even a moment later. Well, he couldn't think like that. With trembling fingers, she unlocked the case and pulled out the vial. The liquid inside shimmered, nearly luminescent. She barely remembered the instructions Reyes had given her, but there was no room for doubt. She uncapped the injector, pressed it against Lior's frail arm and released the dose. For a moment nothing happened. Then his body jerked. Celia nearly dropped the injector as Lior let out a sudden, shuddering gasp, his entire frame racked with convulsions. Her mother cried out, reaching for him, but Celia held her back, her own breath caught somewhere between terror and hope. The seizure passed as quickly as it had begun. Lior slumped against the cot, but his breathing was deeper now, steadier. Color, faint but present, was returning to his skin. Celia pressed a hand to his forehead. The fever was breaking. Her vision blurred with tears. A quiet sob escaped her and she bowed her head, clutching his small hand in hers. He was going to live. But relief was a fragile thing. Outside, the distant wail of sirens sent ice through her veins. They knew. Celia shot to her feet, her mind racing. Had someone seen her? Had they traced Reyes' ship? It didn't matter. They were coming. And if they found the medicine, if they found her, there would be no mercy. Her mother looked up, her face drawn with fear. "You have to run." Celia shook her head. "I can't leave him." "He needs you alive, Celia," her mother said fiercely. "Go. I'll protect him." Tears burned in her eyes, but she forced herself to nod. One last glance at Lior, then she turned and slipped out the back door, vanishing into the night. The streets were already swarming. Armed patrols in dark uniforms swept through the district, their boots heavy against the stone. Celia pulled her hood lower and kept to the shadows, her heart hammering. If they caught her, they wouldn't ask questions. They wouldn't need to. She moved quickly, winding through back alleys, slipping past patrols as they tore through homes and shops. A sharp whistle cut through the air, an alert signal. They were tightening the search perimeter. She needed help. And there was only one person who might still give it. The docks were alive with movement, smugglers and traders scrambling to pack their goods before the patrols spread further. Reyes stood near his ship, speaking in low, hurried tones to a mechanic. His jaw was tight, his posture stiff, he was preparing to leave. Celia didn't hesitate. She darted forward and grabbed his sleeve. He reacted instantly, grabbing her wrist and yanking her into the shadows behind a stack of cargo crates. His eyes were sharp, his expression unreadable. "What the hell are you doing here?" "They know," she panted. "They're searching the city." Reyes muttered a curse, glancing toward the patrols. "How much do they know?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But if they find me, they'll find Lior." For the first time, something flickered across his face, something close to guilt. He exhaled sharply. "You should have gone into hiding." "There's nowhere to hide." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he looked back toward his ship. The patrols were getting closer, moving methodically through the market. It wouldn't be long before they reached the docks. "You have a choice," he said finally. "I can get you off-world. Take you somewhere safe. But if you stay here—" "I can't leave him," Celia interrupted. "I just need a way to keep them from looking for me." Reyes studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a muttered curse, he pulled a small, unmarked case from his coat and pressed it into her hands. "Take this to the patrol captain. Say you found it. Say you were reporting suspicious off-world goods. It's enough to get them off your back, if you sell it right." He stared at the case. "What's in it?" "Enough contraband to make them think they've won," Reyes said. "And not enough to get anyone killed." She hesitated. If she did this, she would be throwing someone else to the wolves. As if reading her thoughts, Reyes' expression softened, just slightly. "They don't care about justice, Celia. They care about looking like they're in control. Give them something to parade around and they'll stop looking for you." She took a breath, steadying herself. She didn't trust him. Not completely. But he was right. She tightened her grip on the case. "Thank you." His smirk was faint but present. "Try not to get caught." She turned and disappeared into the night. By the time she reached the patrol, she had forced her fear into something cold, something controlled. She stepped forward, lifting the case just as the guards turned toward her. "I think I found something," she said, letting just the right amount of hesitancy slip into her voice. "I wasn't sure what to do." They took the bait. As they swarmed the case, barking orders and declaring an illegal off-world smuggling ring dismantled, Celia let herself exhale. They would leave her alone now. She could go home. By the time she slipped back into her house, Lior was stirring. His eyes cracked open, weak but clear. When he saw her, his small fingers curled around hers, his grip stronger than it had been in days. "Mom," he whispered. Celia choked back a sob, brushing his hair back. "I'm here," she murmured. "You're safe." Outside, the city moved on. The patrols would leave soon. Reyes would be gone before the sun rose. But Lior would live. And that was all that mattered. Daniel Reyes didn't believe in fate. He believed in choices, in consequences, in the weight of debts that could never be repaid. He told himself that's why he was still here, loitering in the shadows of the docking bay long after he should have been gone. It wasn't because of guilt. It wasn't because of some foolish, lingering attachment to people he had no business caring about. It was just unfinished business. That's what he told himself. The patrols had taken the bait. He had watched them parade through the streets with the case he had handed off to Celia, smug in their manufactured victory. The moment they had what they wanted, they had turned their attention elsewhere, the hunt for her conveniently forgotten. She had played her part well. She was safe. That should have been enough. It wasn't. The city was settling into uneasy quiet when he finally moved. He had half a mind to leave, to push the Wayfarer's engines past their limits and never look back. Instead, he found himself walking. Not away but toward the lower district, toward the small, unremarkable home where he knew she would be. He didn't stop to question why. When he reached the door he hesitated. It was a bad idea. He had done his part. She owed him nothing and he had nothing left to offer. And yet, he knocked. The silence stretched long enough for him to reconsider. Then the door cracked open. Celia stood there, exhaustion carved deep into her features. But there was something else now, something lighter. He didn't need to ask to know. Lear had made it. The medicine had worked. The fight was over. She studied him for a long moment before stepping aside, wordlessly inviting him in. He followed, his movements slower than usual, as if the weight of the past few days had only just settled into his bones. Inside, the dim glow of the wall fungi cast the small space in soft, flickering light. Lear lay asleep on the cot, his breathing even, his skin no longer the sickly pallor it had been. Celia's mother dozed in the corner, her body curled protectively toward the child. Celia crossed the room, kneeling beside the cot and running a gentle hand through Lear's hair. "He's strong," she murmured almost to herself. "Stronger than I ever knew." Daniel leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Takes after his mother." She huffed a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "I don't know about that." He did. But he didn't say it. Instead he pulled a small pouch from his jacket and tossed it onto the nearby table. It landed with a soft thud, the weight of the credits inside unmistakable. Celia frowned. "What is this?" "Insurance," he said simply. "They'll stop looking for you for now. But if you ever need to disappear, this'll help." She stared at the pouch, then at him. "Why?" He didn't have an answer that made sense. Not one that fit the man he was supposed to be. "You shouldn't have had to do this alone," he said finally. She looked away, her fingers tightening around Leor's blanket. "I didn't have a choice." Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "There's always a choice. Sometimes they all just..." He paused, searching for the right words. "Sometimes they all just suck." That earned him a small, tired smile. "That sounds about right." For a moment, there was nothing but the quiet hum of the city beyond the walls, the distant murmur of life moving on. He should go. He would go. But then Celia turned back to him, something unreadable in her gaze. "Where will you go now?" Daniel hesitated. He had spent years running, never staying in one place long enough to ask himself that question. The galaxy was wide and there was always another job, another debt, another reason to keep moving. But for the first time in a long time he wasn't so sure. "Don't know," he admitted. "Haven't figured that out yet." Celia studied him, then nodded as if she understood something he didn't. "If you ever do," she said softly, "you know where to find me." Daniel held her gaze for a long moment. Then without another word he turned and walked away. This time he didn't look back. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the cockpit window, distant and indifferent. Reyes had always found comfort in that. The sheer vastness of space, the way it could swallow anything and everything, including a man who wanted to disappear. But tonight, as the wayfarer cut through the void, he found no comfort in it. Just silence. Just the echoes of a choice he hadn't quite made yet. He should have left it all behind. That was the smart thing to do. No attachments. No regrets. Just another job, another system, another reason to keep running. And yet, his hands lingered on the controls, his course drifting aimlessly beyond the designated flight path. With a frustrated sigh, he pushed back from the console, rubbing a hand over his face. He needed a job, something to keep his mind occupied, something to remind him who he was. Reyes wasn't the kind of man who looked back. He wasn't the kind of man who got involved. Except he had. A sharp beep from the comm panel pulled him from his thoughts. An incoming transmission, encrypted, no identification code. That was never a good sign. Reyes tapped a command, bringing the message through. The voice that came over the line was clipped, precise and unmistakably familiar. "You're not where you're supposed to be, Reyes." His jaw tightened. "Nice to hear from you too, Captain Orlon." Pause. "We lost track of you after the last drop. Imagine my surprise when I found out you were still loitering around Vornis 3, getting involved in local affairs." Reyes leaned back in his chair, forcing his voice into something lazy, unconcerned. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't insult my intelligence," Orlon said flatly. "You gave them something. A distraction, a false lead. That's not how this works. You don't interfere." Reyes sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Didn't realize we had rules now. You know better, Orlon said. And more importantly, you know who's watching. A cold weight settled in Reyes' chest. He had been careful. He had made sure the case he gave Celia wouldn't lead back to him. But Orlon was right. There were bigger players in this game, the kind that didn't take kindly to loose ends. You're pushing your luck, Orlon continued, his voice dropping to something almost warning. If you're smart, you'll keep flying and forget that woman and her kid ever existed. Reyes didn't answer immediately. He could do exactly that. It would be easy. Turn off the comm, set a course for some backwater sector, take a contract, keep moving. Let Celia and Lior become just another memory. But his fingers hovered over the control panel, unmoving. Orlon sighed as if sensing his hesitation. Look, I don't care what you do with your life, Reyes. But if you make this our problem, then I won't be the one calling you next time. Understand? A slow, creeping dread coiled in Reyes' gut. He knew what that meant. I understand, he said, his voice quieter than before. The transmission cut out. The ship hummed around him, a gentle, rhythmic pulse that had always felt like home. Now it just felt like a cage. Reyes stared at the empty screen for a long moment before leaning forward and keying in a new destination. He didn't think. He just acted. Instinct, or maybe something else, something that felt too much like responsibility. As the wayfarer banked into a sharp turn, changing course, he allowed himself a quiet, bitter chuckle. Maybe he wasn't done with Vornis 3 after all. Celia knew peace was temporary. For 3 days she allowed herself to believe in it. Lear was healing. The fever had broken, and though he was still weak, there was color in his cheeks again. He smiled more, asked questions, reached for her hand in quiet moments as if grounding himself in the world he had almost left behind. She held him tighter than she should have, afraid that if she let go he might slip through her fingers. The patrols had moved on just as Reyes said they would. The lower district was still on edge, but the immediate danger had passed. She should have felt relief. Instead, a tight knot of unease coiled in her stomach. Something wasn't right. The feeling followed her through the streets as she made her way to the market, sticking to the quieter paths. She walked with her hood drawn low, old habits she couldn't shake, but no one looked at her twice. The people of the lower district had learned long ago that survival meant minding your own business. She stopped at a vendor, exchanging quiet words for a handful of dried ration packs, when she noticed them. 2 men, dressed in dark civilian clothes, the kind that didn't stand out but didn't quite belong. They weren't local, she knew every face in this part of the district, and theirs were unfamiliar. More than that, they were watching her. Not openly, but with the kind of careful, measured attention that sent warning signals through her veins. She forced herself to finish the transaction as if nothing was wrong, tucking the rations into her bag before walking away at a steady, unhurried pace. She didn't glance back, but she listened. The market was noisy, merchants haggling, distant machinery humming, but she could still hear the soft, deliberate footsteps trailing behind her. Her pulse quickened. Celia turned down a narrow side street, slipping between stacks of discarded cargo crates. She made it 2 blocks before she pivoted sharply into a dead-end alley, pressing her back to the wall, waiting. Seconds later, the footsteps slowed. The 2 men appeared at the alley entrance. One was tall and lean with a sharp, angular face. The other was broader, his posture relaxed but his eyes cold. They didn't look surprised to see her waiting. "You've been hard to find," the taller one said. His voice was smooth, practiced. "That's usually a bad sign." Celia didn't answer. Her hand inched toward the knife hidden beneath her cloak. The broader man noticed. He smiled, slow and amused. "If we wanted a fight, you wouldn't have seen us coming." She didn't relax. "Who sent you?" The taller man tilted his head slightly. "A mutual acquaintance. Someone who's very interested in the kind of company you've been keeping." Cold dread prickled along her spine. She kept her expression neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man's smile was polite, but his eyes remained empty. "I think you do. The real question is, do you know what he is?" Celia clenched her jaw. She didn't answer. The taller man took a slow step forward. "We're not here to hurt you, Celia. We just need to know what Reyes told you. What he gave you." "I don't have anything," she said evenly. The broader man made a quiet noise, something between a chuckle and a sigh. "That's unfortunate." The taller man studied her for a long moment, then pulled something from his pocket and held it out. A small data chip. If you change your mind, he said, you know where to find us. He set the chip on a crate beside her and turned, walking away without another word. His partner followed, but not before casting her one last, knowing glance. Then they were gone. Celia remained frozen for several long seconds, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stared at the data chip, the small object carrying far more weight than its size should allow. He should leave it. She should pretend this never happened. But she already knew she wouldn't. Because whatever Reyes had done, whatever he had dragged her into, wasn't over yet. Reyes had barely set foot on Vornis 3 before he knew he'd made a mistake. The docking bay was quiet, too quiet. No patrols, no dock workers lingering for extra credits, no desperate smugglers trying to bribe their way onto a departing freighter. Just silence, thick and unnatural. It was a trap. He could still turn back. Slip into the Wayfarer, power up the engines and be gone before they even knew he was here. Should have. Instead he stepped forward. His boots echoed against the worn metal floor as he moved, hands loose at his sides but ready. He didn't need to check his weapons, he knew exactly where they were. The weight of his blaster sat comfortably against his hip, but he didn't reach for it. Not yet. Movement flickered at the edge of his vision. Reyes turned just as a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim glow of the docking bay lights. Sharp-featured. Familiar. On. Reyes exhaled slowly. Should have known. Orlon smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I warned you, Reyes. You did, Reyes admitted. Didn't realize you cared so much. Orlon's expression remained unreadable. I don't. But the people I work for? They do. Reyes tensed. And who would that be? A second figure stepped forward. A woman, this time dark-clothed, her gaze assessing. Not one of Orlon's usual crew. You've made some powerful enemies, she said. Her voice was smooth, deliberate. Ones who don't appreciate interference. Reyes smirked. Funny. I don't remember interfering in anything that wasn't already a mess. Orlon sighed. Reyes. But the woman raised a hand, silencing him. You're clever. I'll give you that. But you should have kept running. Reyes rolled his shoulders, loosening the tight coil of tension in his muscles. Guess I'm bad at taking advice. The woman studied him for a moment, then gestured to the side. More figures appeared, 3, maybe 4. Armed but not aggressive. Not yet. You're going to tell us where she is, she said. Reyes didn't blink. She who? The woman smiled slightly. Celia. Something cold settled in his gut. You're wasting your time, he said evenly. She's gone. The woman tilted her head. Then you won't mind if we check for ourselves. Reyes forced a chuckle. You really think she stuck around after everything? She's smarter than that. Orlon shifted slightly, his expression unreadable. But the woman just watched Reyes, considering. Finally she sighed. It doesn't have to be difficult. Reyes grinned. Good. Because I don't do difficult for free. Her eyes narrowed. Last chance, Reyes. The air between them stretched thin, electric with unspoken tension. The moment before a storm. Then Reyes moved. Not hesitation. Not negotiation. Just action. He was faster than they expected. He always was. A sharp pivot, a twist of his wrist, and his blaster was free before the first shot rang out. The docking bay erupted into chaos. Orlon cursed, diving for cover. The woman shouted an order, but Reyes wasn't listening. He was already running. Blaster fire streaked past him, too close, heat searing the air. He ducked behind a cargo crate, breath sharp, adrenaline surging through his veins. A second later he returned fire, forcing them to scatter. Orlon's voice cut through the noise. Damn it, Reyes. Reyes smirked, but it was tight, controlled. Told you I don't take advice. Another shot. Another. Then an opening. Reyes took it. He vaulted over a set of crates, hitting the ground in a roll, momentum carrying him forward. The ship was close, just a few more steps. A bolt of plasma scorched past his shoulder. He twisted, fired back, caught sight of the woman snarling something to her men. They weren't giving up. He reached the ramp of the Wayfarer and slammed his fist against the control panel. The doors hissed open and he stumbled inside, hitting the emergency close before spinning toward the cockpit. Engines roared to life. Systems powered up in rapid succession. Outside, the woman barked another order. Too late. The thrusters ignited and the wayfarer lifted off in a sudden burst of acceleration. The docking bay fell away beneath him and then, stars. Reyes exhaled hard, hands tight around the controls. His heart was still pounding, but he didn't stop. He set a course. Not away. Not to safety. Back to her. Celia barely slept that night. She sat at the edge of the bed, one hand resting lightly on Lior's back as he breathed in steady, even rhythms. The fever was gone, but exhaustion still clung to him, his body weak from the battle it had fought. He had always been small for his age, but now he looked fragile, breakable. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not now. Not when she knew someone was watching. The data chip lay untouched on the table beside her. She had tried to ignore it, tried to pretend it didn't exist, but it sat there like an accusation. A door waiting to be opened. With a quiet sigh, she picked it up. It was standard tech, small, sleek, unmarked. No way to tell where it had come from or what it contained. Which meant there was only one way to find out. She rose from the bed, moving carefully so as not to wake Lior, and crossed the room to the old terminal by the window. The screen flickered as she powered it up, its worn edges humming softly. Her fingers hesitated over the input slot. Once she did this, there was no turning back. But there had never been a choice, not really. She inserted the chip. The screen flashed, lines of code unraveling, and then a single file. Audio. Celia pressed play. Static filled the room, followed by a voice she hadn't heard in years. Her breath caught. If you're hearing this, it means I'm out of time. She gripped the edge of the desk. The voice was strained, words clipped, like he had been speaking quickly, under duress. She knew that tone well. I don't know who I can trust. They found me faster than I expected, and if I don't make it out, someone has to know the truth. Pause. Celia, if you're listening, watch your back. They're coming for you too. Her stomach twisted. The message cut off abruptly, but the damage was already done. She stared at the screen, at the empty void where the recording had played, heart hammering in her chest. She had spent years running from the past, but the past had found her anyway. A soft sound from behind her made her turn. Lior had shifted in his sleep, brow furrowing as if caught in the edge of a dream. She watched him for a moment, forcing her breathing to steady. No matter what happened, she wouldn't let them take him. The terminal beeped, drawing her gaze back. Another file had appeared. Encrypted. She had just reached for the controls when a noise outside made her freeze. Footsteps. Too many. Moving fast. Her pulse jumped. She killed the screen instantly, plunging the room into darkness. Then she moved. She was at Lior's side in seconds, shaking him awake. He blinked up at her sleepily, confusion flickering in his eyes. Mom, he murmured. Shoo, she whispered, pressing a finger to his lips. We have to go. His small body tensed beneath her hands, but he didn't argue. He knew better than to ask questions. She grabbed the pack she had prepared earlier. Emergency supplies, credits, enough to get them out. She had hoped she wouldn't need it. She should have known better. A sharp knock at the door sent ice through her veins. She pulled Lior close, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Stay behind me, she murmured. Then she reached for her knife. The door burst open. The door crashed inward, metal buckling under the force of the impact. Celia moved before the dust had settled, shoving Lior behind her as figures stormed into the room. Shadows against the dim glow of the city beyond the window. 3, no 4 of them. Armed. Prepared. She didn't wait for an introduction. The knife flashed in her hand as she lunged, quick and low. The nearest intruder barely had time to react before she drove the blade into the soft gap beneath his ribs. A sharp exhale, a stagger. Then she twisted and wrenched the weapon free, letting him drop. The others hesitated. She saw it in the flicker of their eyes, the brief uncertainty. They had expected a cornered woman, a desperate mother. Not a fighter. Not a threat. Their mistake. Celia didn't waste the advantage. She grabbed the nearest chair and hurled it at the second man, forcing him back as she surged toward the door. Lior clung to her side, small fingers wrapped tightly in the fabric of her sleeve. A voice barked an order. Don't let them. Too late. She was already moving, dragging Lior with her as she tore into the hallway. The corridor was narrow, old pipes lining the walls, the air thick with the scent of rust and damp concrete. She ran. Footsteps pounded behind them. Shouts, the clatter of weapons. A turn. Another. The building was a maze, one she knew well. She had memorized every passage, every hidden exit. They wouldn't catch her. Not if she was fast enough. A stairwell loomed ahead, winding downward into the darkness. She took the steps 2 at a time, Lior's breath sharp beside her. Then, movement below. She caught the glint of a weapon, the shape of another figure waiting at the landing. Her mind raced. Options. Risks. She had seconds. She spun, redirecting. A side door. Unlocked. She shoved through it into an empty storage room filled with rusted crates and broken machinery. The only light came from a cracked ceiling panel, buzzing faintly overhead. She pressed Lior into the shadows. "Stay quiet," she whispered. He nodded, wide-eyed but steady. "Brave." Footsteps thundered past outside, shouts echoing down the stairwell. Celia held her breath. 1 second. The noise faded. She exhaled, tension coiled tight in her muscles. They weren't safe yet. She turned, scanning the room. No windows. No other doors. They were trapped. Her mind spun through possibilities. She could double back, find another way out. A soft beep cut through the silence. She froze. A comm device. Coming from one of the crates. Celia's pulse pounded as she moved toward it, heart hammering in her chest. She flipped the lid open, revealing a small, compact communicator resting among old, discarded tools. It was active. A voice crackled through. "You always were good at running." He stiffened. The voice was smooth, almost amused. Familiar. She picked up the device, fingers tightening around it. "Orlon." A low chuckle. "It's been a while." Her jaw clenched. "Not long enough." Silence. "Then, you have something we need, Celia." She glanced at Lior. He hadn't moved, but his small hands were balled into fists, his expression tight. He recognized the tension in her voice. Celia turned back to the communicator. "I don't know what you're talking about." Orlon sighed. "Don't do that. You listened to the recording. You know what's at stake." Her fingers curled against the cold metal of the device. "And if I don't?" Pause. Then his voice dropped, quieter. "Then they'll never stop coming." She inhaled sharply. "You don't have to fight this alone," Orlon continued. "Give us the chip. Let us handle the rest." Her grip tightened. "I don't trust you." Another chuckle, softer this time. "You never did." Silence stretched between them. Then, Lior's small voice, quiet but firm. "Mom." Celia looked down at him. Big steady eyes. No fear. Just trust. She turned back to the communicator. And made her choice. Celia exhaled slowly, gripping the communicator as if she could crush Orlon's voice into silence. The past had a way of finding her no matter how far she ran, no matter how carefully she hid. But this wasn't just about her anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Lior watched her, his small face calm but expectant. He didn't ask what was happening, didn't demand explanations. He trusted her, even when the world was crumbling around them. She made her decision. "I'm not giving you the chip," she said flatly. Orlon sighed. "Celia, you think I don't know how this ends," she cut in. "If I give it to you, I lose control. You say you'll handle it, but I've heard that before. I've seen what that means." Orlon was silent for a moment. "Then, you don't have a lot of options." "Neither do you," she countered. Pause. "They'll keep coming." "They already are," she said. A small chuckle. "That's what I always liked about you. Stubborn. Even when it's hopeless." She bit back a sharp retort. "Are you the one sending them?" Another pause. "Not this time." That surprised her. "So who is?" "You know the answer." Her grip on the communicator tightened. Of course she knew. It always came back to them. The ones who had torn her life apart, who had left her with nothing but scars and secrets. The ones who had made sure the universe never let her rest. "The information on that chip," Orlon continued, "it's bigger than just you. Or me. You think you're protecting Lior by running, but you're only delaying the inevitable." Celia's jaw clenched. "And your way is better?" "At least my way gives you a chance." Silence stretched between them. She didn't trust him. He never had. But he wasn't wrong. She turned, scanning the storage room again. The voices outside had faded, but she knew better than to think they were safe. "We need to move," she murmured to Lior. He nodded, small fingers curling into her sleeve. Orlon's voice crackled back through. "Celia." If you do this alone you won't make it. She closed her eyes briefly then opened them. Steady. Focused. I always make it. Without another word she crushed the communicator beneath her heel, the device shattering with a sharp crack. No more distractions. No more ghosts from the past whispering in her ear. She took Lior's hand, leading him toward the other end of the storage room. A rusted maintenance hatch sat half-hidden beneath debris. She shoved the crates aside, revealing a narrow shaft leading downward. Lior peered inside then looked up at her. Where does it go? Somewhere we can disappear, she said. At least for now. She helped him climb in first, his small frame slipping easily into the dark. Then she followed, pulling the hatch closed behind them. As they descended into the unknown, she didn't let herself think about Orlan's warning. She didn't let herself wonder if, this time, he was right. The tunnel was narrow and damp, the air thick with the scent of rust and stagnant water. Celia moved carefully, one hand braced against the curved wall as she guided Lior forward. The metal beneath her fingers was old, corroded by time and neglect, but it held. Lior's small feet barely made a sound as they descended. He didn't complain, didn't ask questions, though she could feel his unease in the way he clung to her sleeve. He was trying to be brave and that alone hardened her resolve. They reached the bottom of the shaft where the tunnel stretched out in both directions, vanishing into darkness. Celia hesitated, recalibrating her mental map of the city's underground. It had been years since she'd last used these routes and she couldn't afford a mistake. She reached into her pack and pulled out a small light, flicking it on. The dim glow illuminated the tunnel walls, layers of old pipes and cables, forgotten infrastructure buried beneath the city's foundations. More importantly, it revealed the faded markings she had once memorized. She found the symbol she was looking for, a barely visible arrow scratched into the metal, pointing left. This way, she whispered. Lior nodded and followed without hesitation. They moved quickly but carefully. The tunnels weren't just a sanctuary for those who wanted to disappear. They were a labyrinth, dangerous even to those who knew them. Some sections were flooded, others collapsed. And there were worse things than unstable ground lurking in the dark. Celia kept an ear tuned for pursuit. The men who had stormed their room wouldn't give up easily. If Orlan was telling the truth and she hated that she even considered it, then bigger forces were in play. That meant she had even less time than she thought. A distant clatter echoed through the tunnel. She stopped abruptly, pulling Lior against the wall and killing the light. Her heart pounded in the silence. The noise came again, metal shifting, something moving in the dark. Not footsteps. Something else. Lior's fingers tightened around her wrist. He heard it too. She exhaled slowly, straining to listen. The sound was faint but rhythmic, a scraping that sent a chill through her. He recognized it. Drones. Her breath hitched. They must have deployed them through the lower levels, using heat signatures to track movement. She should have expected it. Whoever was after them had resources. They wouldn't rely on simple foot soldiers alone. Celia scanned the tunnel with narrowed eyes. There, a side passage half blocked by collapsed debris. It was risky, but staying put wasn't an option. She crouched beside Lior, voice barely above a whisper. We have to move. Quietly. Stay close to me. He nodded, his face pale but determined. They slipped through the gap, squeezing between fallen beams and shattered stone. Dust clung to her hands, the sharp scent of damp earth filling her lungs. The tunnel beyond was narrower, forcing her to crouch as she led the way. The walls here were different. Older, crumbling brick instead of reinforced metal. This wasn't part of the city's original infrastructure. This was something forgotten, something buried. And it might be their only chance. The drone noise faded as they moved deeper. It wouldn't last. If they were using scanners, it was only a matter of time before they recalibrated. They needed an exit. Celia scanned the walls as they moved, searching for anything. A vent, a hatch, a way out. Then she saw it. A faint seam in the brick, the outline of a door long sealed. The kind of thing that wouldn't show on modern blueprints. She ran her fingers along the edge, feeling for weakness. Lear watched her, eyes wide. What is it? An old maintenance passage, she murmured. If we're lucky it still opens. She pressed her shoulder against the stone and pushed. Nothing. Years of neglect had sealed it tight. Lior stepped closer. I can help. She hesitated but nodded. Together they pressed against the door, muscles straining. For a moment it held. Then, with a groan of protest, the stone shifted. A crack, a gust of stale air, and then the door lurched open just enough for them to slip through. Celia pulled Lior inside, shoving the door shut behind them. Darkness. The air was colder here, untouched by the city above. She reached for the light again, casting a dim glow over their surroundings. A stairwell. Worn steps descending into even deeper darkness. Lior swallowed hard. Where does it go? She didn't have an answer. But above them the drones were still searching. And below? It might be their only escape. She took his hand. Let's find out. Together they stepped into the unknown. The stairs stretched downward into a silence so complete it pressed against Celia's ears. Each step was worn smooth by time, edges rounded and uneven. The air thickened as they descended, laced with dust and something else. Something ancient and undisturbed. Lior's grip on her hand was steady, but she could feel the slight tremble in his fingers. She squeezed gently, a silent reassurance. He was brave, braver than any child should have to be. The light from her small lamp barely reached beyond a few steps, the walls curving inward as if the passage itself were swallowing them. This place was older than the city above, older than any map she had ever seen. They reached the bottom. A tunnel stretched forward, lined with stone rather than metal, the ceiling arching high above them. The walls were marked with symbols, faint carvings worn down by time. Celia ran her fingers over them briefly, feeling their deep grooves. Not human. He swallowed. We keep moving, she murmured. Lior didn't question it. They pressed forward, their footsteps muffled against the stone floor. The tunnel was dry, the air stale but still breathable. It had been abandoned long ago, yet something about it felt watched. Celia forced herself to focus. The drones wouldn't find them down here, not easily. But she had no idea where this passage led, and she couldn't afford to be trapped. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The tunnel twisted and turned, revealing no doors, no ladders, no indication that anyone had walked this path in centuries. Then, a whisper of movement. Celia stopped instantly, her hand tightening around Lior's. The sound had come from ahead. Soft. Almost imperceptible. But not imagined. She flicked the light higher, the beam sweeping across the walls. The carvings had changed. More defined, more deliberate. They formed patterns now, symmetrical lines that led forward. Another sound. Closer this time. Lior tensed beside her, but he didn't speak. Celia exhaled, slow and silent, and moved forward. The tunnel widened ahead into a chamber. Vast. Its ceiling vanishing into darkness. The walls were lined with alcoves, some empty, some filled with shapes she didn't want to examine too closely. The carvings here were deeper, newer. Someone, or something, had been here more recently than she had assumed. A shape moved in the corner of her vision. She turned sharply, raising the light. Nothing. Just stone and shadows. But she knew better. Lior, she whispered, keeping her voice calm. Stay close. He obeyed without question, his small fingers curling into the fabric of her sleeve. They stepped forward cautiously, scanning the chamber. There was another passage at the far end, narrower than the one they had come through. A way forward. Then behind them. A breath. Not theirs. Celia spun, reaching for her knife. A figure emerged from the shadows. Tall, draped in fabric that blended into the stone, their face obscured by a hood. Their movements were slow, deliberate, not hostile but not welcoming either. Celia's grip on the knife tightened. We don't want trouble. The figure tilted its head slightly, considering her. Then, in a voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. You walk in forgotten places. The words weren't a threat. They were a statement. Celia kept her stance firm. We needed a way out. Silence. Then the figure took a step forward and Celia resisted the urge to move back. Lior pressed against her side, his breathing steady but shallow. You carry something, the figure said. Something they seek. Celia's pulse quickened. She didn't ask how they knew. Instead she lifted her chin. And if I do? The hooded figure studied her for a long moment. Then unexpectedly they turned toward the passage at the far end of the chamber. You should not linger. Celia hesitated. Why? The figure's voice was softer now. Because you were followed. The words sent ice through her veins. She didn't question them. She grabbed Lior's hand, moving quickly toward the passageway. The hooded figure didn't stop them, didn't move to block their way. They only watched as Celia and Lior slipped into the narrow tunnel beyond, vanishing into the dark. And as they left, Celia could have sworn she heard the figure whisper, "Run." Celia didn't look back. Her breath came fast and shallow as she pulled Lior through the narrow passage, her grip firm but not crushing. The stone walls pressed in, rough against her shoulders, the tunnel forcing them forward in a single file line. Her mind raced through possibilities. Who had followed them, how much of a lead they had, whether the hooded figure had been friend or foe. None of it mattered if she didn't get them out. Lior kept pace, his small hand warm in hers. He didn't ask questions, didn't slow. He had learned, far too young, that survival didn't wait for explanations. The tunnel sloped downward, the air growing cooler. Their footfalls echoed in the enclosed space, too loud, too obvious. Celia bit her lip, forcing herself to slow just enough to listen. Footsteps. Not theirs. Distant but steady. She pulled Lior to a stop and killed the light. Darkness swallowed them. Her pulse drummed in her ears as she strained to hear. The footsteps were still far but moving at a steady pace. No rush, no hesitation. Whoever was behind them knew exactly where they were going. A cold realization settled in her stomach. They weren't just being followed. They were being herded. She exhaled slowly, forcing her thoughts into order. If this tunnel wasn't a dead end, then it led somewhere. And if their pursuers weren't in a hurry, it meant they expected to catch them there. That gave her two choices. Wait and fight, risking Lior's life in a confrontation she wasn't sure she could win. Or move faster, get ahead and turn the trap on its creators. She squeezed Lior's hand in silent warning, then flicked the light back on and pushed forward. The tunnel widened, the walls curving into something more structured. Old stone pillars, archways barely holding under the weight of time. This wasn't just a passage. It had been something else once, something grand. Then she saw it. An opening ahead, light filtering through from above. The exit. And standing in front of it, a figure. Not hooded like the one in the chamber. This one was armored, sleek and silent, a helmet obscuring their face. A pulse rifle hung loosely in their grip, not yet raised but ready. Celia stopped short, shoving Lior behind her. The figure tilted their head slightly. "You're faster than I expected." The voice was smooth, modulated through the helmet. No clear accent, no identifiable tone. Celia's fingers twitched toward her knife. "And you're more predictable than I expected." A quiet chuckle. "That's what they always say. And yet here we are." The footsteps behind them grew closer. Celia's mind raced. The figure hadn't shot yet. That meant they wanted something. Her, or Lior. None of those options were acceptable. She glanced around, assessing the space. No obvious cover, no alternate exits. Just the pillars, the broken stone, the centuries of dust. And Lior. Small. Quick. She tightened her grip on his hand for just a second. Long enough for him to understand. Then she moved. She shoved him sideways toward the shadow of a fallen column as she surged forward, knife flashing in the dim light. The armored figure barely reacted, shifting just enough to dodge her first strike, but she wasn't aiming to kill. She was aiming to distract. A gunshot echoed through the chamber, a bolt of energy searing past her shoulder, but she was already twisting, already diving low. The figure countered smoothly, bringing the rifle up. Lior moved. Small hands grabbed a loose rock, hurled it with all the force he had. It struck the figure's helmet, not enough to do real damage, but enough to disrupt their focus for a fraction of a second. It was all Celia needed. She slammed into them, knife carving against the joints of the armor, searching for weakness. The figure grunted, stumbling back, but they were trained, fast, efficient. Their hand snapped up, grabbing her wrist in an iron grip. Celia snarled, twisting, but they wrenched her arm back. Then Lior was there, kicking the side of the figure's knee with all his strength. The armor absorbed most of it, but the unexpected impact made them falter. Celia tore free, rolling backward, knife still in hand. The figure recovered, rifle raising again. Then something else moved. From the darkness of the tunnel, a second shape emerged. Not armored. Not human. The hooded figure. Their voice, soft as before, carried through the chamber. "You do not belong here." The armored figure barely had time to react before the hooded one lifted a hand, and the air itself seemed to shift. A pulse of energy rippled outward, unseen but felt, pressing against Celia's skin like a sudden drop in pressure. The armored figure staggered as if the very ground had tilted beneath them. Celia didn't waste the opportunity. She grabbed Lior's hand and ran. The exit loomed ahead, the light beyond blinding after so much darkness. Footsteps pounded behind them, hers, Lior's, and something else, something heavier. Then open air. Cool night wind hit her face as they burst onto a ledge high above the city. The world stretched out below them, neon lights flickering in the distance. The hum of civilization a stark contrast to the ancient silence they had left behind. No time to stop. She scanned the ledge, searching for a path downward. Ladders, cables, anything. Behind her, the armored figure stumbled from the tunnel, rifle raised. But before they could fire, the hooded figure stepped into the light. The air shifted again, and the city below seemed to bend. Celia didn't understand what she was seeing. Buildings blurred at the edges, light distorting, reality itself seeming to ripple like disturbed water. The armored figure staggered back. Not from an attack. From fear. They turned without a word and vanished into the tunnel's darkness. Celia breathed hard, holding Lior close as she turned to the hooded figure. "You saved us," she said cautiously. The figure didn't answer immediately. Then finally, "Not yet." Their voice was calm. Certain. And somehow that scared her more than anything else. The wind howled against the ledge, tearing at Celia's cloak as she tightened her grip on Lior. Below, the city stretched out like a labyrinth of flickering lights and winding streets, but the ledge itself offered no clear escape. The drop was sheer, a fall that would shatter bone long before they reached the ground. The hooded figure stood still, facing the tunnel's entrance. Their presence felt heavier now, as if the air itself thickened around them. Celia swallowed. "What did you do to them?" The figure didn't turn. "I reminded them." The words were simple, but they sent a chill down her spine. Behind them, the tunnel remained dark, but the enemy had retreated, for now. That meant they still had time, however little it might be. She turned her attention back to the ledge, scanning for anything that could help. There, a thin metal maintenance ladder bolted to the rock face a few meters away, barely visible in the dim light. It was rusted, ancient, but it might hold. "Lior, listen to me," she said, crouching beside him. "I need you to go first. Get down as fast as you can. Don't look back, don't stop." He hesitated, wide eyes flicking to the hooded figure. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you." He nodded once, the kind of trust only a child could give so freely, and moved toward the ladder. Celia turned to the hooded figure. "I don't know what you are or why you helped us, but I won't stay here waiting for them to change their minds." The figure finally shifted, their head tilting slightly as if studying her. Then they stepped forward, closer than before, close enough that she could see the faint glow of something deep within their hood. Not eyes. Something older. "You carry something important," they murmured. "Something worth dying for." Celia stiffened. "I don't plan on dying." The hooded figure extended a hand, palm up. "Then let me help you." She hesitated. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But the sound of distant footsteps echoed from the tunnel once more. Many this time. They were returning. She exhaled sharply and took the offered hand. The world twisted. For a breath, everything was weightless, as if the ground had vanished beneath her. The wind stopped howling. The city lights blurred. She landed hard, knees bending instinctively to absorb the shock. Her hand snapped to her knife before she realized where she was. The rooftop of a building. Far below, the ledge where they had stood moments before was empty. The tunnel mouth still loomed in the distance, but there was no sign of the approaching enemy. No hooded figure. Just her. And Lior standing beside her, breathing hard. She stared at him. "Are you okay?" He nodded, but his fingers trembled where they gripped her sleeve. "What just happened?" Celia didn't have an answer. She turned her gaze back toward the ledge, but it was too far now, as if the city had stretched impossibly beneath them. Whatever the hooded figure had done, it had taken them away. She didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. But there was no time for either. She pulled Lior close, shielding him as she scanned the surrounding buildings. They were still exposed, still vulnerable. The enemy tracked them here. A flicker of movement caught her eye. A drone. Small, hovering just above the adjacent rooftop. Watching. Celia cursed under her breath. They're already looking. She grabbed Lior's hand. We keep moving. No more hesitation. No more second-guessing. She didn't know who the hooded figure was. She didn't know why they had helped her or how. But she knew one thing. This wasn't over.